Tonight on KQED Newsroom, PG&E, the nation's largest utility, has filed for bankruptcy. Wildfire victims are angry and lawmakers are pushing for change. Plus, a look ahead at next week's State of the Union speech amid a divided government in Washington, and the rising prominence of Bay Area lawmakers in Congress. And Oakland catching Hollywood's attention. With the Oscars around the corner, we'll look at how movies with Oakland roots have become big hits. Hello and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. We begin with the high-stakes bankruptcy of PG&E. On Tuesday, the utility giant filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The company claims it faces tens of billions of dollars in potential liability for deadly California wildfires in 2017 and 2018. This is the second time in less than 20 years that PG&E has declared bankruptcy. In a statement, PG&E said it expects no disruption in services and that it will keep helping wildfire-affected communities recover and rebuild. But the bankruptcy filing now puts on hold lawsuits filed by wildfire victims who could wait years before getting paid. State lawmakers are now seeking ways to have more control over what happens next. Joining me now to discuss all of this are KQED politics and government reporter Marisa Lagos and California State Senator Jerry Hill. He chairs the Senate Subcommittee on Gas, Electric, and Transportation Safety. And Mark Toney, Executive Director at TURN, the Utility Reform Network. Welcome to you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Marisa, this bankruptcy filing leaves a lot of people in legal limbo. So what's going to happen with electric rates and also liability payments to wildfire victims?
Well, I think that's the $30 billion question right now, which is the amount of liability that PG&E says it has outstanding. You know, I think that that is really what we're going to be watching here at KQED and others, is how much do these folks get a seat at the table. One thing, you know, that we know about bankruptcy courts is that's not inherently the structure there, that the creditors are really sort of first in line and that they're concerned, you know, with basically bringing the company out of bankruptcy. That's the way the law is structured. But I do get the sense that things may be a little different this time. We just saw on Friday, the governor sent a letter to the U.S. trustee who's in charge of creating those committees, asking that ratepayers and wildfire victims be considered as actually parts of those committees, which was not the case in the first PG&E bankruptcy.
So hoping that they don't fall to the back of the line.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the judge has really indicated that he is very aware of the situation here, right? He's already let public comment happen, which is not something that ever happens in courtrooms, bankruptcy or not. I would assume he's a PG&E ratepayer. He is a San Francisco-based judge, and I think that, you know, he's well aware of the sort of public discussion here. So I think it's going to be up to people like Mark Toney and Senator Hill and also the wildfire victims and their lawyers to make sure that they don't get forgotten. But I do think that that's a key part of this discussion already.
Senator Hill, you've been a fierce critic of PG&E ever since the San Bruno explosion in your district. What would you like to see happen in the expected restructuring of PG&E?
Well, I think the main thing in the restructuring, and at the end of the day, as it comes out of bankruptcy court, I think we want to make sure that the ratepayers are protected. We want to make sure that the victims have the compensation that they need to get their lives back in order, and that the contracts with labor are preserved too. But I think what we have to look at carefully is the conclusion I came to before early on was that they're just too big to succeed. They're a very cumbersome, bureaucratic organization. One end doesn't know what the other one's doing, and we've seen such evidence of that over the years. So I think if there's some restructuring that can, and perhaps break them up into a gas and an electric division, that's been said a lot, but I think that may help.
Well, the unions have made it clear they don't want to see it broken up into little pieces. Right. What do you think of all this, Mark Toney? Do they need to be broken up?
I think the most important thing right now is that there needs to be new leadership at PG&E, and it needs to happen really quickly. Judge Alsup, federal court Judge Alsup, has the opportunity to appoint a receiver, which is what we're recommending, to take charge of the company, make sure that the safety regulations are being carried out so that we can stop more wildfires from happening.
I should point out that Judge Alsup is the judge overseeing the probation case out of the San Bruno explosion. But is that really the best option? You have said 2 weeks ago when you were on this show that you thought PG&E should declare bankruptcy, that was the best option.
Well, it's the best option for them. I mean, this is a bankruptcy out of convenience, not of necessity. Bankruptcy for them will provide them the opportunity to restructure, and really they come out the winner and we come out the loser. But it may be the opportunity for us to look at some opportunities for public power as they're in bankruptcy. There may be some municipalities that are interested in purchasing their infrastructure. San Francisco shows an interest. San Jose. I heard other cities are interested as well. That may be a determinant.
But that does get to, I think, to the big challenge here, which is that, you know, the procurement of the power is not the problem, right? We have PG&E has really been out front on helping the state get to its climate change goals. We know that the infrastructure is the challenge here. That is both the most expensive part of really their sort of, you know, operation, their capital operation there, but it's also the part that we've seen fail repeatedly. And so whoever takes that over, whatever the company or a co-op or a public utility looks like, they're still going to have these deferred maintenance problems, these challenges with just the size of it. And so, I mean, what I think is really interesting is how the conversation is changing. In some ways, Jerry Hill's been out by himself, kind of screaming into the winds in San Bruno in the Capitol. And there's been a lot of deference to PG&E. And I think that has shifted. And I think you've seen the sort of way that lawmakers and this new governor are approaching this. And I think Gavin Newsom's one to really watch.
But how much power do lawmakers have in this? Because you don't really have a say in the bankruptcy proceedings. So how do you ensure that you have a voice in what emerges out of this in whatever shape or form PG&E might be in?
I think we do have a say at the end, because as the Public Utilities Commission has to approve any reorganization or restructuring or the rate structure that's put into place after that, we as legislators can, through statute, kind of direct the PUC and take some of that authority ourselves and perhaps approve whatever the restructuring plan is at the end. So I think that's where the legislature needs to exert itself, and I'm planning to do that.
You mentioned Judge Alsup earlier, and Judge Alsup in a court hearing this week, he expressed doubt about PG&E. When PG&E says, you know, safety is our #1 priority, he came out and said he doesn't think that's true. He also suggested that he thinks the California Public Utilities Commission has been too lax in its oversight. Do you have confidence that the CPUC will be able to provide adequate oversight of this restructuring as it happens in bankruptcy?
If we're talking about wildfire safety and making sure that the trees don't come into contact with lines, which is what's causing the fires, we have to give the CPUC the resources that it needs to put inspectors on the ground to make sure that PG&E is doing what they need to do. But the other thing is, I feel very strongly that we need new leadership at PG&E, and that if Judge Alsup appoints a receiver, he will have somebody that will be accountable to him to make sure that his orders are carried out. Right now, simply telling PG&E over and over again to comply with the law doesn't seem to be working. They have a record and history of not complying, not trimming the trees, and recently of falsifying tens of thousands of pipeline inspection records, the call before you dig 811. There's no excuse for that.
Would you support having PG&E become a public company?
I think that's one of the options that we should look at. What I want to be careful about is that we don't end up in a situation where the densely populated areas get covered and the expensive rural areas get left out and get stuck with very high costs. We want to make sure that we preserve a system, even if it's public, where we can spread the cost and the risk among a large number of customers and not just have a two-tier system, good, cheap service in the cities and poor, expensive service in the rural areas.
What are some of the challenges, Marisa?
Well, I mean, I think, first of all, it's sort of, it speaks to where we're at with the CPUC, that we need a federal receiver in Mark's mind. And we saw that in the San Bruno case, too, earlier, that, you know, the feds came in and did this investigation. So I think his point about a more robust, well-funded CPUC is a good one. I think that we did see a lot of ethical issues come out with their connections to PG&E through that San Bruno case. And some of them do seem to have been addressed. You know, I think that when you talk to people who've worked at PG&E, they feel like a lot of the problem has been in the leadership, not in the sort of rank and file. while. I think most people agree with that. Yes. But it is a really hard question, and I mean, the structure of them, I think, is something that is worth looking at, because there is this perverse incentive when you are trying to answer to Wall Street on one hand and serve customers on the other. You know, our water department,
it absolutely is. But it works, and the other utilities have been able to do that and balance that. But PG&E, for some reason, after the bankruptcy in 2001, they changed their focus. Their CEOs are CFOs. They come from the financial industry. They're looking to please Wall Street, not Main Street.
Senator Hill, what about the broader issues here, too? Let's take PG&E out of this and the bankruptcy out of this. The broader concerns about where utility transmission lines are located. Do we need to put legislation in place that forces all of them underground? And does there need to be additional legislation on home construction in fire-prone areas?
Well, and that certainly is an issue right now in Sacramento, is whether those areas should not have, in the middle of a forest, you should be building. Undergrounding the utilities sounds good. It's a great idea, but Mark would be right there. You know, it's a very expensive proposition to do that, and it may not be necessary. You can harden the grid, harden it in a lot of ways that does not include undergrounding the utilities.
Well, what are some of those ways?
Well, as San Diego Gas and Electric did after their major fires in 2007, they have steel poles now. They don't have wooden poles that will collapse or burn in a fire and fall over in a wind. They have hardened and insulated their conductors through the system, so they've protected their infrastructure and made it strong enough so that it won't be falling. As we know in PG&E, at least from what has been reported, the transmission towers are 100 years old in some cases. You can't succeed when you have that type of infrastructure.
I have to agree with Senator Hill on this. There are ways to cost-effectively make the system much more safe. We need to do that, and we need to do it quickly. Undergrounding, in addition to being extremely expensive, takes way too long to be able to deal with the fire risks that are upon us every single summer. So we need to do as much as we can now before the next fire season that is reasonable and that will make a difference.
All right. Well, thank you. On that note, Mark Toney with TURN, Marisa Lagos with KQED, and State Senator Jerry Hill. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Now to politics. President Trump says the theme for his State of the Union address on Tuesday is unity. Sitting behind him at that speech will be House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, whose maneuvering led the president to back down from demanding a border wall in exchange for ending the government shutdown. In recent weeks, Pelosi has also been assigning Bay Area lawmakers to several key House committees, including Homeland Security and government oversight. Meanwhile, in California, a fight is brewing between state officials and cities over affordable housing. Attorney General Javier Becerra is suing the city of Huntington Beach, claiming it's not allowing enough low-income housing. Joining me now to discuss all of this are KQED Senior Editor of Politics and Government, Scott Schaefer, and Hoover Institution Fellow, Lanhee Chen. Welcome back, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Lanhee, let's start with the President's State of the Union address. He's giving this speech amid looming tensions over keeping the government open, over the border wall, over the Russia investigation. Amid that backdrop, how confident are you that he will be able to deliver a unifying message, which is what he's vowing to do?
Well, it wouldn't be consistent with what he's been like so far as president. I would think there's two different pathways he can take with this speech. One is to look to issues where there is common ground with Democrats: prescription drug pricing, infrastructure reform. These are areas where the Democrats would potentially work with the president. Or he can go to the issues that his base cares about, like immigration. And so far, that's been his play. That's been where he's been most comfortable. And frankly, the politics of this dictate, I think, a speech that's less unifying. As he thinks about 2020 and his reelection campaign, he really needs to consolidate that base. And the issues that will consolidate that base are not the same issues that Democrats are going to want to talk about in terms of working together with Republicans.
I would agree. I mean, I don't think he's ever really tried to unify. I mean, if you go back to his inaugural address, it was very dystopian, focusing on crime and how the middle class, very dark. And so that seems to be his only play in his playbook. I don't think he's tried to really reach very far beyond his base, but I agree that he could. And I am also going to be looking for how does he treat Nancy Pelosi? Does he call her Madam Speaker, or is it at Nancy. You know, he could be gracious and sort of extend an olive branch, but that's just not in his nature. Well, maybe he'll, you know, have a new play for the State of the Union, but we just haven't seen that.
Immigration is a very big issue in California. It's a key issue for him. And among those in the audience will be an undocumented immigrant who worked at one of his golf courses. She was invited by a Democratic congresswoman. Scott, how will that affect any message that the president delivers on immigration and border security and protecting jobs for Americans?
You know, it reminds me of what Steve Bannon did during one of the debates with Hillary Clinton, where he brought some of these women that had accused Clinton of sexual assault to the debate. You know, it's kind of a distraction. I think it's meant to kind of throw him off of his game a little bit. But I think that the concern that Democrats have, and some Republicans, frankly, is that he's going to declare a national emergency in the speech and therefore try to go around Congress to get the money from the Pentagon or other places in the budget to build this wall. But, you know, I think that there is a way to talk about a wall of security that would include fencing and technology and beefing up the public border access points and the Coast Guard. But, you know, I think that things like inviting somebody who was an undocumented worker that got, I think, fired from his company is really not going to help.
It'll be interesting to see the tone and approach the president takes to immigration, because recall, this is happening while the congressional committee that was convened after the shutdown to discuss immigration policy is continuing its deliberation. The president can set the tone for where that committee goes. He's already tweeted, by the way, that it almost doesn't matter. He thinks it's a waste of time what this committee does, which suggests that he's already got his mind made up.
Well, he told the New York Times he's going to build that wall anyway. So do you think he will declare a national emergency?
I think that's the most likely outcome at this point. I mean, it's unlikely. Look, this committee that's been formed to discuss immigration is made up of people who are relatively moderate overall on immigration. You don't have a lot of hardliners. So even if they come to some really fabulous agreement that, let's say, 80% of Americans would agree on, is that committee going to be able to get agreement from the hardline Democrats and the very conservative Republicans and President Trump? It's unlikely. So the outcome we're going to end up with, I don't think, is another shutdown, because nobody wants that to happen. What we're going to end up with is President Trump exercising unilateral authority, I think.
Okay, let's talk about California's congressional delegation, because when he delivers this speech, it will be in front of a Congress where California has the largest number of House members ever, 53 in all. And Nancy Pelosi has named some Bay Area Congress members to some key committees. Let's start with Barbara Lee, Scott. She lost her race for the Democratic caucus chair position, but she got a pretty plum assignment from Nancy Pelosi anyway.
She did. You know, she wanted that position, and she lost to Hakeem Jeffries, who's a real up-and-comer from New York State. But Barbara Lee is also known, she's very liberal, no question about it. If you look at her voting record, she's one of the most liberal members of the House. And yet she's also a conciliator. You know, she brought together the Bernie Sanders supporters with the Hillary Clinton supporters at the Democratic Convention in Philadelphia in 2016. So I think in this role on this committee, where they're trying to bridge the differences, she's a good choice.
Do you think she'll use the position, though, to build more progressive power in the House?
On this committee, you mean?
Yes.
I don't think so. I think Nancy Pelosi, I think, chose people who were not in it for themselves, but were in it to try to come to some kind of an agreement that everybody, including the president, can live with. And you know, Democrats have been for fencing. They've put lots of money toward border security. There is a way. You know, the question is, will the president take yes for an answer? I think.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see. And also in the California delegation, you've got this interesting mix of people who are quite progressive, people particularly who were elected in the 2018 cycle, who come from that part of the party. But you've also got potentially some more moderate elements. So how those all mix together and what that looks like will be an interesting subplot as Nancy Pelosi continues her speakership.
Okay, and let's move on to there's something really interesting happening on the housing issue in California, and that is Attorney General Javier Becerra is suing Huntington Beach in Orange County for trying to compel it to construct more affordable housing. Scott, explain to us, what are the laws that the Attorney General thinks Huntington Beach is violating? Well,
there was a law passed last year, I believe, that allows the state to sue local governments that aren't meeting their housing goals or that are actively trying to avoid meeting their housing goals. And so the Governor Newsom, and Javier Becerra got together, and they've been talking about this for quite some time, probably since, before Gavin Newsom got there. Huntington Beach is in Orange County, is one of those places that has been blocking housing. There's a lot of NIMBYism down there. And so, Newsom is really making building housing in general a priority. He put in $2 billion into his budget. And so it's kind of a carrot and stick situation. He's sort of firing a warning shot across the bow of Huntington Beach. Now, down there, they just elected some Democrats for the first time in a while, to the legislature, and they're nervous that this sort of trying to take away local control is going to hurt them. I mean, they didn't get elected by big margins.
Are there other cities in the crosshairs, particularly in the Bay Area?
Well, I wonder about Marin County, where the governor lives, because Marin has been notoriously opposed to building more housing. We've heard about Brisbane down in San Mateo County as well. So.
Lonnie, about 20 seconds. What do you think about all this?
The conflict between local control and what the state responsibility is going to play out in this issue area, as it has in many other issue areas. But fundamentally, the question on housing is going to be who's in the best position to do it. The localities are going to continue to argue we should have control, and obviously the governor and the attorney general feel differently.
All right, Lan-Hee Chen with the Hoover Institution, and your podcast is Crossing Lines. Yes. Thanks for being here. And Scott Schaefer with KQED, and also your podcast, Political Breakdown. Thanks to you.
Thank you.
Oakland is having its Hollywood moment right now with 3 acclaimed films set in the city, including Black Panther, the first superhero movie to be nominated for a Best Picture Oscar. The movies were made by filmmakers with East Bay roots and have brought global attention to Oakland. The city has long been a hub for art and activism, but it's now dealing with gentrification and a struggle for its identity. The 3 movies touch on these themes in their own way. Black Panther's primarily black cast was hailed as an important cultural moment. Sorry to Bother You tells the story of miserable telemarketers trying to survive in an alternate present-day version of Oakland. And Blindspotting is a dark comedy about police violence and the intersection of class and race.
Yo! Bro! Stop! Stop! Don't you! Don't...
And joining me now is Carvell Wallace. He's a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine and a columnist at SLATE. So nice to have you here.
Happy to be here.
So I saw Blindspotting, and it covered so many complicated things, race, class, police brutality, Oakland's gentrification. What is it about the movie's treatment of these issues that you think resonated so well with film critics and with audiences?
Well, I think the film represented a more modern take on the intersection of race and class. I think that, you know, ever since, if you look at music, ever since like the invention of the iPod, you've started to get a lot more mixing of ideas and culture, people growing up listening to metal and rap and that kind of thing. And I think that the generation that's grown up with that aesthetic has found its voice. And I think that Blindspotting is part of that. And I think Oakland and Berkeley have been ahead of the curve for a long time on that. And I think now the rest of the country is sort of catching up on where those ideas become political.
And 2018 was such an extraordinary year for Oakland, right? Besides Blindspotting, there was Sorry to Bother You by Boots Riley. He's a longtime activist in Oakland. And of course, there's Black Panther, partly set in Oakland, and that's earned more than $1 billion worldwide. What does this say about the kinds of movies and filmmakers coming out of the city?
Well, I think that, like I said before, I think it means that the rest of the country is on some level catching up with some of the things that have made Oakland unique. And I think a lot of what's made Oakland unique historically is its particular mix of culture and race.
And that's what informs these
that's
filmmakers.
That's what informs these filmmakers. Yeah, I mean, these are people who grew up. You might have one teacher that was a Black Panther. You might have one teacher that's a PhD at Cal. You might have one cousin that's both. You might have one aunt that was a hippie. So kids are sort of growing up at working class with all these influences: the intellectual, the urbane, hip hop, politics, these sort of things.
You might have a family member who was affected by police brutality.
Absolutely. I mean, and so I think that a lot of that generation that has grown up, I think the rest of America has caught up to the idea that that's the new, sort of not newer definition of American citizen. And I think the Bay Area has been ahead of the curve on that.
So how permanent do you think this is? Does this signal a lasting shift in Hollywood regarding what kinds of stories and storytellers are supported, or is it more of a blip?
I think it remains to be seen. I mean, I think that the good thing about the internet is that it's allowed artists to validate their hypotheses publicly before gatekeepers agree. In other words, you can make content, and as a result of that content, you can go to a studio or to someone who has the purse strings and say, look, here's 1 million likes, here's 1 million retweets, here's 1 million followers. We can guarantee this works. I think that has permanently changed the face of Hollywood. Whether or not that continues to mean Oakland gets representation, or rather that representation spreads out, kind of remains to be seen.
We had the commercial success of movies like Black Panther and Crazy Rich Asians, which used the internet for its auditions and in other ways to its advantage, but primarily movies featuring non-white casts are very rare. What else needs to happen at the decision-making level to make that more commonplace?
Yeah, I think there needs to be more diversity at the decision-making level. I think that there needs to be more diversity at the level of greenlighting, more diversity at the level of funding. There's a big difference between kind of building a platform online and getting, you know, $20 million funding for a movie. It's hard to do that online, and I think that what we're seeing is the rise of some decision makers, some people who own networks, who own big enough bank accounts that they can really make decisions about feature films. We're starting to see more diversity in those ranks, and I think that's really the main thing that will make it happen.
And the movies that we talked about, the 3 movies that came out of Oakland, they were in the works well before the 2016 presidential election. Sorry to Bother You was decades in the making. Blindspotting was the 10-year project. How do you think the current political environment affected the final product and how the public perceived them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the current political climate has affected the way those projects are received. I think whenever, you know, the part of what art does is it validates the humanity of the people about whom the art is made. And so that's why representation has always been important, because more representation means more validation of humanity. And so I think that after Trump and after the election, there were a lot of people in this country who felt like it was now even more important, more vital to validate the humanity of women, of people of color, of queer, LGBTQ, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that has been reflected in the way that people have shown up for these projects, because they know the power that those projects hold in the face of what we're seeing politically.
And you've lived in Oakland for 20 years.
Yeah.
So how do those changes that you're talking about right now, the current political climate, as well as the gentrification, affecting the work of filmmakers and other artists who live in Oakland?
Well, I think Oakland's in a really tough spot, because, I mean, in order for there to be an artistic movement in a place, that place has to be affordable, because artists have to be able to work sort of at the beginning of their careers when they're not making a lot of money. And the reality is that those 3 filmmakers, maybe possible with the exception of Boots, but not even, had to essentially leave Oakland in order to get their projects funded, right? I mean, the producers, where the money comes from, I mean, Black Panther's a Marvel project. Marvel's not based in Oakland. And so I think that gentrification makes it hard for people to live here and stay here. So on the one hand, we're seeing the upping of Oakland as a brand, but simultaneously, we're kind of seeing a diminishing of Oakland as a place where artists can live and work and still afford to pay rent.
And that's certainly the ongoing struggle. Carvell Wallace, contributing writer for the New York Times, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
And that will do it for us. As always, you can find more coverage at kqed.org/newsroom. I'm Thuy Vu. Thank you for joining us.